murder, accused of killing her husband and then fleeing the country.
The defendant was extradited from it.
His remains found in a box.
On an ordinary morning in May, a farmer in the state of Michigan went out to his field, just as he did every day. But he noticed something strange he had never seen before, and never expected to encounter. In this remote field, far from any main road, or a large locked burnt metal box. Amidst a pungent, unforgettable odor, he approached it cautiously. He stepped back, grabbed his phone, and made the call that would open a case that wouldn't be closed for over a decade.
Yesterday.
When the police arrived at the field on May 2002, they found inside that metal box a body that could not be identified in any way. No features, no identity, almost no traces. Just a human who once walked, talked, and laughed, now turned to embers in an abandoned berry field known by no one. Investigators classified the case as a homicide immediately, and forensic teams began their work, but they had almost nothing to go on. The fire had consumed everything almost completely, and the case remained unresolved, without an identity or a lead to follow. For 13 whole years, that burned body remained unidentified, and the crime remained hidden, until a coincidence came from a place no one expected. A television screen in a distant living room in Texas, and from a woman who knew what no one should have known. Before we reach that fateful night, we must pause at this family that seemed on the surface like any other family. A mother trying to rebuild her life after years of turmoil and a doll holding an unspoken grudge, and a man trying to be a partner, and a partner in a chaotic life, the true scale of which he did not understand. Beverly McCall lived with her boyfriend Robert Carballo, a man whose record wasn't entirely clean. He had previously been to prison, and when he got out he seemed different. He was reading the Bible a lot and trying to move away from the chaotic life he once knew. But that new calmness created a problem he didn't expect it, as he began to openly reject Denine's lifestyle, and he didn't want her near him much. And it didn't stop there, but extended to Christopher McLean, Denine's close friend, who was staying in the same house and who had to pretend in front of Robert to be just an ordinary friend, nothing more. For Robert, with his newfound faith, would not accept some of the arrangements the household was used to. This silent, mounting tension between Robert on one side and Denine and Christopher on the other was simmering under the surface day by day, while Beverly was in the middle, with her own motives and her own problems, with the same man. And in that charged atmosphere, the family spent their days in May 2002, moving toward a moment that could not be reversed once it occurred. In 2015, and after 13 years of the case being stagnant, 37-year-old Denine Ducharme was sitting in her home in Texas, and she watches a documentary about an unsolved murder mystery. The documentary detailed the discovery of a body inside a burned metal box in Michigan, titled Jack in the Box. Something in those details shook Deanne to her core, because she knew those details, not because she saw the news at the time, but because that burned body was related to her. She contacted the authorities and told them that the remains could belong to Robert Carballo, her mother friend who disappeared years ago without an explanation. So, like Rapardundu, The authorities conducted a DNA test, and the result was conclusive. Robert Carballo had finally been found, or what was left of him. Investigators reopened the file, and connections that had been buried for over a decade began to surface one by one, shifting the investigation toward those close to Robert, including the people Deanne knew well. The first real breakthrough in the case came from the person no one expected to talk back. Christopher McMillan himself, when the investigator met him and began talking. Christopher didn't wait long before starting to speak, as if what had been trapped inside him for years had finally found someone to listen to. The investigator later described how it seemed as if a burden was being lifted from Christopher's shoulders the more he spoke, as if he had been waiting for that knock on his door for years and knew it was inevitable. Christopher confessed to his involvement in the crime and provided a detailed account of that night that resembled no version Deanne had presented before. What happened was not a random crime resulting from a passing argument that escalated. Rather, it was something much colder and more calculated than anyone dared to imagine. Christopher signed a plea agreement in exchange for a lighter sentence, and openly admitted that the crime was premeditated and organized. The night before witnessed an actual rehearsal where everyone knew their place and role in advance. When the details of his confession reached the investigators, it became clear that there were two other names that had to be pursued. The first was sitting in the interrogation room from the start. When Deneen sat before the investigator, she thought she was in control. She spoke with the manner of someone cooperating in placing all the details on her mother. On that, she went even further, explicitly claiming she wasn't near the crime scene when that had happened. She said she and Christopher were sitting together on a sofa in a side room far from the basement, and that Christopher specifically was the only witness who could confirm she wasn't involved. Every time the investigator pressed harder, she resorted to her fallback card: a head injury, memory loss, and many events she couldn't remember. But the investigator knew more than he showed. He knew that Christopher had painted a completely different picture, one where Deneen wasn't sitting on a sofa in a side room. He knew that in the basement of that house, there was a new cement patch that looked like it had been laid in a hurry, and that, Christopher confirmed at dacht cost of be honest, because she was skilled in construction work. When he asked her about the patch, she said she didn't remember. When he asked if she had participated in what he called a prior rehearsal, she erupted in strong denial. But her words were too intense for someone with no connection to the matter. Then the investigator delivered his final line with complete calm. "We found your DNA in that cement patch in the basement." Sitting, paused, then said, "That surprises me," and fell silent. After the confessions and evidence piled up, the picture became complete, with no room for other interpretations of that night in May 2002, Monday. It started with an argument in the basement between Robert and Beverly, and the tone escalated. But what happened that night was not born of that moment. It had been planned an entire day earlier in a cold-blooded rehearsal. In it, Beverly was the one pulling the strings, defining the roles and giving the instructions. And when the act in the basement ended, Beverly gestured to her daughter and demanded in a sharp voice, "Give me the hammer, give me the hammer." Deneen grabbed the hammer with her right hand and struck Robert on the left side of his head 2 or 3 times. Then Beverly snatched the hammer and struck him with her left hand 3 or 4 times on the left side of his head until it sank in. While this was happening, Deneen and Christopher were pressing a plastic bag over his face until he stopped moving entirely. After everything was over, they placed the body inside a metal trunk. They drove the car a long distance until they reached a remote berry field in Michigan and set fire to the trunk to erase every trace. Then they returned home as if nothing had happened. In the morning, when Cecily, Robert's actual daughter, who was on the same trip and had been awakened by the sound of a huge explosion in the dark, asked about him, she was told that Robert had traveled to Canada, but his car was still parked in the driveway untouched by anyone, and Beverly McCallum fled to the United States when she found out. The case was reopened. She married in Pakistan and tried to build a new life, but flight was not a permanent solution. Investigators tracked her in Rome in February 2020, where she was arrested and extradited to U.S. authorities 2 full years later. She had added a darker shadow to her history when the defense attorney revealed that before the Michigan events, she had married a man in Jamaica known as Guban Rainey, who disappeared mysteriously, and he remains listed on missing persons databases this day, with no trace or fate ever discovered. In April 2024, Beverly McCallum stood before the court after an escape that spanned years and continents. The trial featured testimony from Christopher McMillan on one hand, and from Cecily, who carried memories of a stolen childhood, and a night she was awakened by the smell of a fire no one explained on the other. On the 24th of April, 2024, the verdict was delivered convicting Beverly of second-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse. She was sentenced to 40 to 60 years for the murder and 10 to 15 years for the mutilation, to be served concurrently with credit for the time she spent detained in Italy. As for Deanne and Christopher, they were also issued arrest warrants. The case remains in the minds of observers as a glaring example of a crime its perpetrators thought they had buried forever in a remote field, but the truth, no matter how long its absence, does not burn away. Oh, Salat. The question that remains hanging to this day is, if Deanne had not called investigators herself after watching that documentary, would this crime ever have been uncovered at all?